I want to start today by asking you to think about a really specific feeling.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What feeling?
It's this kind of low-grade exhaustion that you probably experience almost every single day, honestly, whether you explicitly name it or not. I'm talking about the sheer, overwhelming fatigue of living in a culture where absolutely nothing stays settled.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Right. Every rule, every standard of taste, every institution, every historical fact, every single boundary that we used to just take for granted is constantly, endlessly up for debate.
It is relentless. I mean, you wake up and find that a phrase you've used your entire life is suddenly the subject of like a massive theoretical debate online.
Exactly. Or, a basic procedural rule at your workplace has spawned a 3-month committee investigation.
Yeah, it feels like we are constantly reopening the same files, relitigating the exact same territory over and over again.
And what's super fascinating to me is the story we tell ourselves about this fatigue, because we actually have a really comforting narrative to explain it away.
We do. The standard account basically treats this endless debate not as a symptom of a fractured society, but as, well, the ultimate achievement of a mature one.
Right, the idea being that more voices, more scrutiny, more people pushing back against the old gatekeepers, this is what a healthy, pluralistic democracy is supposed to look like. Like, we're finally bringing everything out into the light.
And that comfortable narrative, it was given its most rigorous philosophical defense by a thinker named Jürgen Habermas.
Okay, Habermas, let's unpack his view.
So he argued that as a society modernizes, you inevitably lose the unearned, unquestioned authority of tradition and religion. The days of simply saying, because the king said so, or, because the church said so, those are over.
Right, which most people would say is a good thing.
Exactly. And once those old inherited structures no longer automatically bind everyone, Habermas says the only legitimate way left to figure out how we should live together is through open, rational argument among free and equal participants.
So, in that view, the exhaustion we're feeling is just the cost of doing business. It's the price we pay for giving up on blind deference and actually treating each other as
It's
equals.
supposed to be a victory.
But, and here is where we dive right in. There's a glaring problem when you hold that theory up against reality.
A massive problem.
The arguments we're having today don't actually look like Habermas's ideal of rational consensus building. They just don't resolve.
No, they don't. Which brings us to the actual mission of this deep dive. We are exploring an incredibly powerful essay by Matthew D. Corey called Discipline and Its Counterfeits.
And Corey steps right up to this comfortable narrative and argues that we actually have the mechanism entirely backwards.
He does. And the breadth of this essay is staggering. I mean, Corey argues that this proliferation of endless debate isn't a sign of our cultural maturity at all. It's actually a symptom of lost discipline.
And he goes even further, making the case that it's the direct result of the rise of a very specific social class that actively profits from making sure our arguments never, ever end.
Yes. So our goal today is to guide you through Corey's essay and the absolute powerhouse roster of thinkers he brings in to unpack this.
We're going to look at every single one of them to figure out why we argue so much, what we've lost, and how a truly sophisticated culture should actually operate.
To understand the scope of the loss, we really have to start by naming what disappeared.
Mm.
And Corey brings in the cultural critic George Trow, who diagnosed post-war American culture by pointing to the collapse of something he called the middle distance.
The middle distance. I really want to linger on this because it clarifies so much.
Yeah, go for it.
Trow defines it as that shared civic and cultural space that used to exist between the tiny, intimate scale of your family on one end and the massive, abstract scale of the entire nation or the globe on the other.
Right. It was the space of community, of local institutions, civic clubs, shared cultural touchstones.
And in that middle distance, adult authority used to operate in a very specific way.
It did. It didn't operate through brute force, and it didn't operate through constant aggressive debate. It operated as a largely unstated agreement about what mattered.
Unstated agreements.
Exactly. Agreements about what deserved sustained attention, what was considered serious, and what was considered trivial. These agreements were transmitted to you. You stepped into them. You didn't argue them from scratch every single time they came up.
Trow has this incredible, almost haunting observation about what happens when that space vanishes. He says that modern adulthood basically just consists of the power to enforce childish agreement.
It is a devastating critique of modern
It
institutions.
really is. And I kept trying to picture what that actually looks like in practice.
Hmm.
And think about a group of toddlers playing an incredibly elaborate game of make-believe.
Okay, toddlers.
Yeah, so they're running around, changing the rules every 5 seconds, pretending the floor is lava, getting mad at each other for completely imaginary slights.
Right.
And standing right in the middle of this chaos is an incredibly strict, fully credentialed adult referee, blowing a whistle, handing out penalty cards, completely serious about enforcing the rules of this made-up game.
That is such a perfect analogy. That's exactly what Tro is getting at.
We have built this massive, elaborate machinery of adult competence, human resources departments, legal bureaucracies, massive regulatory frameworks.
The institutions capable of enforcing the letter of an agreement are more powerful than ever. But the substance of what they are presiding over has been totally evacuated of the seriousness that used to justify using adult authority in the first place.
That is the core tension right there. Procedural
Oh, yeah.
adulthood. The referee, the machinery, has completely outlived substantive adulthood, which is the actual seriousness of the game being played.
And the gap between that heavy procedural machinery and the trivial substantive reality is exactly where the low-grade, endlessly renewable arguments of our modern life live.
We argue so fiercely over minuscule behavioral codes or pop culture takes because nothing serious enough to actually settle is at stake. The only thing at stake is capturing enough attention to keep the procedural machinery running.
Exactly. But wait, we have to ask, how did that happen? Because a shared sense of seriousness evaporating sounds like something that would just naturally decay over centuries.
Yeah, just the slow erosion of time.
That's the intuitive assumption. But Corey introduces a historical turning point that suggests something much more deliberate. He argues it wasn't just passive decay. The middle distance was assassinated from within.
Assassinated from within. That's a strong claim.
It is. The hierarchy of seriousness wasn't defeated by an outside army. It was actively dismantled by critics operating from within the very institutions that were supposed to be guarding it.
And he points to the literary critic Leslie Fiedler to show the exact mechanism of how this worked, right?
Right? Fiedler wrote this famous manifesto in 1969, calling for the end of the divide between high culture and low culture.
He called on writers and critics to basically close the gap between elite, serious modernist literature and commercial pulp things like westerns, science fiction, and comic books.
Now, it's vital to note here that the essay explicitly states it doesn't care about adjudicating the literary merits of Fiedler's argument. We aren't here to debate whether sci-fi is as good as poetry. We're just reporting what the essay says.
Right. The point is purely structural.
Exactly. The point is how the boundary was destroyed. For a century, serious criticism had held commercial pulp at arm's length. That boundary was a core piece of Tro's middle distance.
It was an unstated agreement among educated adults about what deserved serious critical attention.
And Fiedler, who was a highly credentialed academic intellectual, used the full argumentative apparatus of literary criticism to attack that boundary on principle.
So wait, is the issue just that he used highbrow tools on lowbrow stuff? Like, I don't know, writing a PhD dissertation on a Marvel movie?
It's deeper than that. To understand why this was fatal to the culture, we really have to look at how Hannah Arendt defines authority.
Okay, Hannah Arendt. Let's bring her in.
We throw the word authority around constantly, but Arendt gives it a very sharp, almost mechanical definition. She says we usually confuse authority with two other things: coercion, which is just brute force, or persuasion, which is argument.
So coercion is someone putting a gun to your head, and persuasion is someone sitting you down and giving you a really convincing PowerPoint presentation.
Perfectly put. And Arendt says authority is neither of those things. It's a third thing entirely. Authority is an accepted hierarchy.
An accepted hierarchy.
Yes. It's a relationship where both parties agree that the hierarchy is legitimate and that agreement exists prior to any argument. If a judge bangs a gavel and tells you to sit down, you sit down because of the accepted authority of the office of the judge.
You don't sit down because the judge pulled a gun, and you don't sit down because the judge gave you a 10-minute rational defense of the ergonomic benefits of sitting.
Right. You just accept the hierarchy. And here is the structural linchpin of Arndt's theory, which Corey applies to Fiedler. The moment you have to use persuasion, the moment you have to defend that hierarchy on its merits against a rival argument, It has already ceased to function as authority.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because I think this is a tough pill to swallow for anyone raised in a modern democracy.
Go for it.
Isn't defending things on their merits a good thing? Like, why is aren't seemingly defending this because I said so dynamic? Isn't it a sign of progress that we demand reasons now?
It's a really natural pushback,
Yeah.
but it misses the mechanical reality of how social trust actually functions. Arndt isn't saying that bad authority shouldn't be toppled or that we should blindly obey dictators.
Okay, so what is she saying?
She's describing a physical property of social relations. Think back to Fiedler. When Fiedler made his formal academic argument that the gap between high literature and pulp should be closed, it didn't actually matter if he won the debate.
Oh, because just by putting it on the table as a valid topic for argument, he destroyed its authority.
Yes. He just needed to make the argument seriously enough, from a position that was credentialed enough, that the old hierarchy could no longer simply be assumed.
Wow.
Once the boundary between serious and trivial became something you had to actively debate, it was no longer an unstated agreement. It was just another topic for endless argumentation. The authority of that boundary dissolved the exact second it became a debate topic.
It's like if a child asks a parent, why do I have to go to bed at 8 p.m.? And the parent, instead of just saying, because it's bedtime, pulls out a whiteboard and starts drawing graphs about sleep cycles and melatonin production.
That is a flawless example.
Even if the parent has amazing data and totally wins the debate, the dynamic has completely changed. They are no longer an authority figure, they're just a debater trying to win over a tiny skeptical audience. And tomorrow night, the child is going to demand a new PowerPoint.
That is a perfect illustration. And that shift from authority to persuasion doesn't just happen with literary boundaries or bedtime rules. It happens to people. It happens to our very identities.
And that's what the sociologist Richard Sennett explored, right? With the fall of public roles.
Exactly. Sennett's work feels incredibly relevant to how we live online today. He talks about the collapse of formal, impersonal public sociability.
So what does that actually mean?
Sennett argues that in the past, society relied heavily on public masks and formal roles. When you interacted with a judge, a critic, a teacher, or a civic leader, you deferred to their office. You engaged with the formal mask they were wearing for public life.
You didn't demand to know their deepest inner soul.
Right. That formality, Sennett argues, was actually the medium that authority traveled in. It provided a safe distance.
So formality wasn't the opposite of genuine connection. It was the mechanism that allowed society to function smoothly without everyone having to bare their souls to each other every time they bought a cup of coffee or went to court.
But today, Sennett says, we've replaced that formality with a demand for sincerity and emotional transparency. Sincerity has become the only register we trust. We no longer trust the office. We demand to see the authentic self standing behind it.
I mean, think about how true this is for every leader, every politician, every creator today. You have to show your authentic self. You have to do the behind-the-scenes video. You have to talk about your personal struggles.
You do. But the problem is, as Sennett points out, authenticity is incredibly fragile.
Because it's endlessly available to be doubted.
Exactly. You can always look at someone pouring their heart out on camera and say, I don't know, they seem a little fake to me. Or they're just performing vulnerability for engagement.
You cannot build stable authority on something as subjective and constantly debated as perceived sincerity. It's a treadmill of having to constantly prove your soul to an audience that is structurally incentivized to doubt it.
And if we're all constantly performing authenticity and terrified of being called fake, doesn't that make us incredibly insecure?
It totally does, which feels like it ties directly into Christopher Lash's concept of narcissism. Now, when we usually hear the word narcissism, we think of vanity. We think of someone taking a million selfies or being obsessed with their reflection.
Right, but Lash is talking about something much deeper. Lash is talking about a historically specific character structure produced by our modern culture. And for him, narcissism is defined by profound fragility, not strength.
Okay, unpack that fragility for me.
A narcissistic character structure is one that constantly needs external validation because it completely lacks any durable internal standards to stand on.
Because the culture stopped transmitting those stable internalized standards, we stopped giving people that middle distance foundation, so they're left frantically looking around at everyone else, trying to manage this fragile, performed self under the constant anxious gaze of their peers.
And authority, Lash points out, requires an asymmetry that this fragile narcissistic character structure simply cannot tolerate. Real authority means someone actually knows better and their knowing better is not up for negotiation.
It's a vertical relationship.
It is. But Lash says we now live in a therapeutic culture which systematically dissolves that vertical asymmetry.
I see this constantly. How does a therapeutic culture actually dissolve that in practice?
By recasting every traditional figure of authority, the parent, the teacher, the priest, the manager, as a validator rather than a judge.
Ah.
In a therapeutic culture, the primary job of these figures isn't to hold you to a standard and judge whether you meet it. Their job is to validate your feelings and your authentic self.
Because to judge someone today is seen as almost morally wrong. It's seen as an illegitimate power grab rather than just the ordinary exercise of competence.
Yes,
Like if a manager says, this work is objectively bad, you failed the assignment, they're often met with, you aren't creating psychological safety or you aren't validating my unique process. The authority to judge has been completely eroded by the demand to validate.
And Lash's later work makes a direct sociological claim about who actually drove this shift. It wasn't a grassroots rebellion from the marginalized that dissolved this inherited authority.
Who was it then?
Lash argues it was driven by a new professional and managerial elite, highly credentialed, highly mobile, educated at the same elite institutions.
Their specific type of cultural power depended on presenting every inherited judgment as a hypothesis that needed to be tested, rather than a verdict that just had to be accepted.
Okay, we're going to dive much deeper into this specific class in a moment because that is the core explosive mechanism of this essay.
But before we get there, Corey introduces Philip Rieff, who is actually Lash's teacher, and Rieff takes this diagnosis further than anyone else.
Rieff provides the deepest cut. He argues that every genuine culture, any culture worth the name, is organized around something he calls an interdictory order.
An interdictory order. Let's break down what that actually means.
An interdictory order is a structure of sacred prohibitions. Deep, fundamental, thou shalt nots. And crucially, a culture does not argue for these prohibitions. It simply transmits them. They are the bedrock.
So you just receive them, you don't debate them.
Right. Rieff claims that authority is always downstream of this sacred order. Authority isn't a separate thing you can just generate out of thin air by being smart. It only exists because it rests on these non-negotiable prohibitions.
So someone has authority not just because they're personally charismatic. They have authority because they're understood to speak for and be bound by the exact same sacred order that everyone else is bound by.
Which leads to Rieff's most profound point about charisma. He says that genuine charismatic authority is totally inseparable from renunciation.
Renunciation, like giving something up.
Yes. It's credible because you can see that it costs the authority figure something too.
Yeah.
They were submitting to the same sacred rules they are enforcing.
But Rieff says we've replaced this entirely with what he calls the triumph of the therapeutic.
The triumph of the therapeutic is the historical process where a culture basically decides that no interdictory order is non-negotiable. We stop believing in sacred prohibitions.
Instead, we reorganize our entire society around the concept of release, the systematic loosening of all restraints.
And this is exactly where the figure of the therapist comes in to replace the priest.
Okay, let's contrast those two figures.
In the old order, the priest was the characteristic authority figure because their job was to help you submit to the sacred prohibition. In the new therapeutic order, the therapist becomes the ultimate authority figure, but their function is the exact opposite.
The therapist's job is to help the patient argue their way out of an inherited prohibition.
Right, to help them realize that the guilt or the restraint they feel is unnecessary and that they should be released from it.
So if a culture stops producing these sacred prohibitions,
Right.
if everything is negotiable and everything is about release, Rieff says we lose the capacity for real authority altogether. We lose authority and we lose genuine charisma because both require something sacred to submit to.
And if we don't have authority, Rieff says we are left with mere celebrity.
Celebrity, which is just a simulation of authority.
Exactly. It runs purely on visibility and attention. It doesn't require any renunciation. It doesn't rest on any sacred order. A celebrity can command your notice. They can make you look at them, but they cannot command you to do anything. They have no actual authority.
I mean, this perfectly diagnoses modern influencer culture. We have millions of people who can command massive amounts of attention, but none of them have the authority to settle a single argument or establish a single binding norm. It's just pure, endless noise.
And Rieff's point is that you cannot build a substitute for this lost sacred order out of mere argument. Argument was never the medium that sacred prohibitions traveled in.
Which is the gauntlet that Corey's essay really has to pick up. If Reef is right that argument cannot replace sacred interdiction, then why did argument become our default mode? Why didn't we just default to brute force or, I don't know, the rule of the richest people? Why is our culture so obsessed with having the right argument?
This is the massive pivot in the essay. We are moving from the psychological mourning of the past into a concrete sociological claim about who actually benefits from the present. And Corey brings in the sociologist Alvin Goldner to answer this exact question.
Okay, Alan Goldner, let's get into it.
Goldner provides the missing piece. He identifies something he calls the culture of critical discourse. This is a specific speech norm that has completely taken over our institutions.
And what's the fundamental rule of this norm?
The rule is that every single assertion, no matter what it is, must in principle be justified on its own terms through argument. You cannot just accept a claim based on the speaker's rank or their office or inherited tradition. It has to be actively justified.
Now, on the surface, that sounds amazing. That sounds like the Enlightenment. That sounds like pure intellectual virtue, holding everything open to reason, accepting nothing blindly.
It looks like pure reason on first encounter, but Goldner makes a deeply uncomfortable observation. He says this speech norm is not actually neutral. It isn't just pure universal reason descending from the heavens.
What is it then?
It's actually the ideological signature and the specific technical skill of a newly dominant social class. He calls them the new class.
The credentialed intelligentsia, the professional-managerial elite, the consultants, the academics, the media figures, the HR directors.
Exactly. Think about how different classes historically secured their power. A clergy's authority rested on scripture and transmission. An aristocracy's authority rested on blood and inherited land. A bourgeoisie's authority rested on accumulated capital and ownership of production.
But this new class, they don't necessarily have aristocratic blood, and they don't necessarily own the factories.
Right. Their claim to social position rests on a specific, learnable, credential-gated competence.
And that competence is the ability to produce and win this exact type of justificatory argument. Their capital is their ability to subject any claim, especially inherited ones, to complex argumentative justification.
Let's use an analogy to really clarify how this operates in practice, because this is the core of the essay.
Okay, here is how I picture it. Imagine a small town that has been run for centuries by the local farmers and the local church. Things are settled by tradition, or by a handshake, or by the town elders. It's not perfect, but it functions.
Right, a functional middle distance.
Now imagine that, over the course of a decade, a guild of highly trained litigators moves into town and slowly takes over all the institutions. Once the litigators are in charge, what happens?
Everything changes.
Suddenly, every single minor dispute, every property line, every town rule requires a massive, complex lawsuit to settle. Why? Not because it's the most efficient way to run a town, but because complex litigation is the only game they know how to play.
And it is the only game they are guaranteed to win against the farmers.
Yes, that is exactly the dynamic Goldner is describing. And it leads to his most explosive conclusion.
Which is that this new class has a structural interest, not necessarily a conscious smoky room conspiracy, but a built-in class interest in making sure that justificatory argument is the only legitimate currency for settling anything.
Because if we go back to settling things by tradition or sacred interdiction, they lose their power. They don't have the sacred currency, they only have the argument currency.
And even more critically, they have a structural interest in making sure these arguments never actually close.
Let's bring that back to the litigators. If a settled argument means no one needs a litigator anymore, then the litigators are out of a job, so they have to keep the lawsuits going forever. They have to constantly find new things to litigate.
It's a brilliant analogy. And Corey brings in two other sociologists, Emile Durkheim and Pierre Bourdieu, to really cement this dynamic.
Let's start with Durkheim.
Durkheim has this concept of anomie, which is a weakened collective conscience. That explains the demand side of our modern confusion. There is a vacuum of meaning because the old consensus broke down.
But Goldner provides the supply side. The new class is actively supplying the endless arguments to make sure that vacuum stays open because occupying that vacuum is their literal job.
Right. And how does Bourdieu fit into this?
Bourdieu has a concept called doxa, which refers to the unspoken, unacknowledged rules of a society.
Right. And Goldner essentially argues that this culture of critical discourse, this demand that everything be endlessly debated in a specific academic register, is the doxa of the new class.
They misrecognize it. They think they're just practicing neutral, universal reason. But They're actually just enforcing their own class-specific speech code, which conveniently secures their own power and invalidates anyone who hasn't been trained in their specific dialect.
So when a modern institution says, we just want to have a rational debate about this, they are actually saying, we demand that you play our specific game on our turf using the exact vocabulary that we spent 6 years in grad school learning.
And if you get frustrated and just say, this is obvious common sense, you lose because you broke the rules of the game.
It's rigged. And Corey points out that if you look back at Habermas, the guy we started with, who said rational debate is the ultimate maturity, his whole philosophy starts to look very different through this sociological lens.
How so?
Well, Habermas talks about ideal speech situations and communicative competence. But through Goldner's frame, that isn't a universal philosophical discovery. It's just the credentialed academic class writing a philosophy that concludes that credentialed academic argument is the only legitimate way to run a society.
Oh, wow. It takes a specific professional skill and dresses it up as the timeless structure of human reason.
That reframes so much of the modern world, and it perfectly explains the symptom that Alistair McIntyre points out. Corey brings in McIntyre's concept of emotivism.
McIntyre famously argued that modern moral arguments are shrill, and they are structurally interminable.
Interminable. They literally cannot end.
Right. We argue endlessly because we're using detached fragments of old moral traditions that no longer make coherent sense together. We have no common measure, so it just evolves into emotional shouting disguised as logic.
Like trying to play a game where half the players are using the rules of chess and the other half are using the rules of Monopoly, and everyone is screaming at each other that the other side is cheating.
Exactly. But Corey uses Goldner to add a pretty sinister twist to McIntyre. McIntyre thinks this interminable arguing is a tragic accident of history.
But Corey says, no, it's a feature, not a bug. A professional class that is highly skilled at producing argument on any topic without ever needing that argument to close is the exact social mechanism that would produce this shrill, never-ending noise.
Because interminability keeps them relevant. An argument that actually closes requires no further argument, which means the arguer is no longer needed.
Okay, this paints an incredibly bleak picture. I mean, we can't go back to the old blind obedience of the past, but this new system of endless professional debate is basically a trap designed to keep us exhausted and keep a specific class employed.
So how do we actually find solid ground? How do we escape both the ghosts of the past and this modern critical discourse?
This is where Corey introduces what might be the most misunderstood philosopher in the entire essay, Max Stirner.
I have to admit, when I saw Stirner's name in the outline, I thought I completely misunderstood what this essay was doing.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, my understanding of Stirner was always that he was this 19th century adolescent provocateur, like the ultimate anarchist edgelord who just wanted to burn everything down.
That is the standard reputation, absolutely. But Corey argues it's a massive misreading, primarily due to translation issues. Stirner is usually known in English by the title of his book, The Ego in Its Own.
Right, the ego.
But Corey points out that this title imports Freudian vocabulary, the ego, that didn't even exist yet. Stirner wasn't writing about a psychological faculty. He was writing about der Einzige, which translates more accurately to the unique, singular existent.
The embodied specific person.
Yes, the unique, singular person who resists being shoved into any general abstract category, including the category of the rational arguer that the new class wants everyone to be.
And Stirner's real target in his philosophy is something he calls the spuck.
The spunk. Sounds like spook. Let's dig into the mechanics of what this actually is.
It translates to the ghost, or the fixed idea. A spuck is an idea that is created by the human mind, but then it escapes the mind, turns around, and stands over the person demanding absolute obedience.
What would be a modern example of a spuck?
God and the state are the classic ones from Stirner's time. But in our context, professionalism can be a spuck. The discourse can be a spuck. Even reason, as a universal standard, can become a spuck.
We treat this specific argumentative style not as a tool that we pick up and use when it's helpful, but as a master that we must constantly obey and perform for. We contort our actual, unique lives to fit the demands of this abstract idea.
So Stirner is saying that the professional arguers of the new class, who think they are the most liberated, rational minds in history, aren't actually free at all. They are possessed by the ghost of their own argumentative method.
They're entirely possessed by the fixed idea of their professional style. So what is Stirner's alternative? He calls it Eigenheit, which translates to ownness.
Ownness. And this is the crucial distinction that separates genuine discipline from the new class's fake version of it.
Let's break down what ownness looks like in practice, because this seems like the only way out of the trap.
Yeah.
Is ownness just being a stubborn contrarian? Like, I'm just going to disagree with everyone to prove I own my mind?
No, that is exactly the trap. Being a contrarian means the crowd still dictates your behavior, just in reverse. Ownness is not a new standard or a new set of rules you have to pass.
What is it then?
It's a discipline. It's a daily standing practice of not being possessed by your ideas.
How do I know if I'm practicing ownness or if I am just possessed by a fixed idea?
Stirner provides an ultimate test, and it is a brutal one.
Lay it on me.
The test is this. Can you drop a position the absolute second it stops working against a hard case without it destroying your standing or your identity?
Can I just drop it? No saving face, no pivoting, just dropping it.
Exactly. A genuinely disciplined person, a true owner of their ideas, uses an idea as a tool. If I am using a hammer and the hammer breaks, I don't write a 10-page defense of the hammer. I drop it and find a new tool.
Right. Nothing beyond the reality of the task itself is at stake.
But the new class structurally fails this test.
Because their professional identity, their paycheck, their social standing among their peers is entirely tied to the performance of arguing that specific position.
Let's go back to the litigators. A good litigator never drops a case just because the facts look bad. Their entire job is to find a procedural loophole to keep the argument alive. If they drop the position, they lose their status in the guild.
They aren't owners of the idea owns them.
A professional whose position depends on being the one who argues persuasively has every incentive to defend a failing idea endlessly, qualifying it, adding jargon, recasting it, just to keep the argument going.
A disciplined person protects nothing but the truth, and so they can just stop arguing when the ground gives way.
That completely reframes the exhaustion we talked about at the beginning. We aren't exhausted because we are debating too much. We're exhausted because we're watching people who are structurally incapable of ever conceding a point because their livelihood depends on the performance of the debate.
It's a simulation of inquiry. But if being possessed by an abstract framework is bad, what happens when we force those frameworks onto real-world, methy problems?
This brings us to Corey's section on breaking frameworks. He wants to show why the new class's abstract models always fail when they hit the real world. And he uses two really powerful examples, Michael Sandel and Lawrence Kohlberg.
Let's start with Michael Sandel, who's famous for his massive moral philosophy classes at Harvard.
Sandel has this incredible classroom demonstration where he takes every major abstract moral framework, utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, libertarianism, and he meticulously walks them into a specific real-world case that is perfectly calibrated to break them.
Like the famous trolley problem variations where maximizing utility suddenly requires you to harvest an innocent person's organs.
Exactly. And the point Corey draws from this is that every abstract framework breaks under the pressure of an actual messy, hard case. Reality is always more complex than the theory. The theory is a ghost. The reality is what matters.
And then there's Lawrence Kohlberg. He created this incredibly famous developmental hierarchy of moral reasoning.
Kohlberg theorized that human beings progress through stages of moral development. At the bottom, you just obey rules to avoid punishment like a child. In the middle, you follow rules to maintain social order.
And at the supposed apex, the top of the hierarchy, you reason from universal, abstract, ethical principles.
Let me guess. The top of the hierarchy looks exactly like a new class academic writing a philosophy paper.
It looks identical. And Corey points out two fatal flaws with Kohlberg's model. First, when you actually reach that supposed apex, the model becomes evasive. It cannot actually specify what these universal principles are without collapsing under the weight of real-world hard cases, just like Sandel demonstrated.
And the second flaw.
The second flaw is even more devastating, and it comes from a brilliant critique by Carol Gilligan.
Carol Gilligan's critique basically unmasks the whole operation.
She observes that Kohlberg's incredibly credentialed scientific method simply found credentialed abstract reasoning at the very top of the hierarchy because the instrument was built by people who reason in exactly that way.
It's the ultimate confirmation bias. We built a scientific test to measure moral superiority, and wow, look at that. It turns out the most morally superior people on Earth are people exactly like us, using the exact vocabulary we use.
It is exactly what Goldner was saying about the new class universalizing their own specific skills and calling it universal reason.
It is the culture of critical discourse masquerading as universal moral development. So if abstract frameworks fail, What actually survives contact with the hard cases?
Corey argues it's something much older than the new class. It's what Aristotle called phronesis.
Phronesis, practical wisdom, how does that differ from the new class models?
Practical wisdom is not about skillfully applying an abstract credentialed framework to a problem. It's about looking hard and attentively at the specific particular situation in front of you, judging the case on its own terms, aided by general principles, but never reducible to them.
It's unobstructed seeing, and this connects perfectly back to Stirner. You can only have unobstructed seeing if you aren't possessed by a spuck, by a fixed idea that tells you what you are supposed to see before you even look.
Stirnerian ownership in practice is essentially Aristotelian phronesis, and this leads to one of the most profound insights in the essay, which explains why genuinely disciplined people often end up agreeing.
This is a point that seems counterintuitive at first. Because if everyone just throws away the rules and looks for themselves, wouldn't it just be chaos? Wouldn't everyone just disagree completely because they're all being unique?
You would assume it leads to radical subjectivism, but Corey argues the exact opposite. He says that two disciplined people, people possessed by nothing, protecting no professional turf, practicing unobstructed looking when they look at the same hard problem, they will actually tend to converge over time. Not because some abstract theory forces them to agree, but because they're protecting nothing, and reality has a specific shape. If you look at a problem long enough, and you aren't trying to twist it to fit your ideology or your professional incentives, you will eventually see the same contours.
This makes so much sense of our daily lives. Most disagreements over our grand ends or goals are actually just technical disagreements about means. We both want people to be healthy. We just disagree on the specific mechanism of the healthcare system.
And disciplined people can argue about means and converge on a solution because it is just an engineering problem. But look at what the new class does. Their characteristic move is to take a tractable technical disagreement about a mechanism and instantly convert it into a sacred identity conflict where one side must be cast as absolutely evil.
Because you can't compromise with evil. If it's an engineering problem, you solve it, you converge, and argument ends. The litigators go out of business. But if it's a holy war over identity, the argument lasts forever.
Turning technical problems into identity conflicts is the most reliable sign that an argument has devolved into professional performance. It is a survival tactic for the argumentative class.
Okay, so the new class is structurally incentivized to keep us arguing, and abstract models are fake. But this raises a foundational question.
What's that?
Even if much of our public debate is this cynical, self-perpetuating performance, doesn't the sheer brute act of arguing with someone imply at least some level of mutual respect? If I completely dismissed you as a human being, I wouldn't even bother arguing with you. I would just hit you. So isn't there a baseline of decency inherent in debate itself, regardless of the new class?
This is the transcendental floor of the argument, and Corey addresses it head-on in Section 6. He looks at the transcendental tradition of thinkers like Carl Otto Hale and, once again, Habermas.
Okay, bringing Habermas back.
They argue exactly what you just hypothesized, that the act of arguing presupposes that you recognize the other person as a rational agent capable of assent and dissent. To argue with someone while denying their rationality is a performative contradiction.
It's hypocritical at a structural level. You are using reason to tell someone they don't have reason.
But Corey also brings in a more grounded physical version of this from Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hoppe's version is fascinating because it avoids the lofty, idealized communicative competence of Habermas. Hoppe locates this reciprocity in the brute physical fact of the body. Arguing is something a physical organism does.
Let's trace the mechanics of that. How does the body dictate respect?
You cannot argue with someone if they are unconscious. You cannot argue with them if you have direct physical control over their brain. So the moment you choose to engage in an argument with someone, you are physically granting them exclusive cognitive control over their own body. You are granting them standing.
And the essay points out the evolutionary roots of this, which adds such a cool dimension. This kind of reciprocity isn't just a magical human philosophical invention. It is seen in the coalition politics and reconciliation behaviors of chimpanzees, elephants, and corvids.
Creatures with dense social structures have evolved capacities for recognizing the standing of others in their group. However, biology is the double-edged sword. Evolution built exclusionary tribal instinct just as readily as it built this reciprocal reasoning.
Biology alone doesn't guarantee that we will treat everyone with this respect, only our in-group.
Exactly. What secures the universal scope of this respect is the performative structure itself. The fact that if I'm arguing with you, even if you are from a different tribe, I have already granted you standing by the very act of engaging.
Okay, so there is a baseline, a transcendental floor of mutual recognition when we argue. We grant each other standing, but Corey points out that this floor is incredibly thin.
It is real, but it is thin. It
Yeah.
says, I must recognize your right to speak and your control over your own body. But it does not deliver the thick content a culture actually needs to function. It doesn't tell us what our policies should be or what is cruel versus what is disciplined.
And this gap between thin procedural respect and thick, settled cultural agreement is exactly what the new class exploits.
They could set up institutions that perfectly satisfy that thin precondition. Everyone gets a microphone, everyone is nominally heard, everyone is respected as a speaker, while structurally ensuring that the thick content never actually resolves.
We are constantly speaking, but we are never deciding.
But there is another angle to this lack of resolution, and it comes from game theory. Corey brings in David Gossier, who derives moral constraint from rational bargaining, and Robert Axelrod's famous tournament studies.
Axelrod's tournaments are legendary. Let's break down how they apply to the Where We Argue today.
Axelrod ran computer simulations to see how cooperative behavior evolves among self-interested agents. It is based on the prisoner's dilemma, and he found that cooperative strategies like tit for tat, where you cooperate first and then just mirror what the other person does, can stabilize and win, but only under very specific conditions.
And those conditions are repeated interaction and transparency.
There has to be a shadow of the future. You have to know that you are going to interact with this same person again tomorrow, so cheating them today carries a cost. And there has to be enough transparency that if someone defects or acts in bad faith, everyone sees it and they are punished for it.
Without those two conditions, cooperation collapses into defection and toxicity.
And this is the massive flashing warning light for our modern public square. Think about your online life or the massive scale of national political debates.
Strangers arguing on the internet are the paradigm case of a thin shadow of the future. You are yelling at an anonymous avatar you will never see again. There is no future interaction to cast a shadow.
And transparency is easily manipulated at scale. So Corey points out a devastating game theoretic reality. Some of the rise in toxic, low-grade public debate might not even be a conscious strategy of the new class, or a grand psychological loss of sacred authority.
What else could it be?
It might just be the straightforward mathematical prediction that cooperative equilibrium breaks down when the scale of the conversation outruns the conditions it needs to survive. We are trying to run human cooperation at a scale where the mathematics of cooperation explicitly break down.
It is a game theoretic collapse of public debate. We have built a machine for mass communication that fundamentally disincentivizes good faith cooperation.
So we are caught between a professional class that wants endless argument for profit and a technological environment that makes good faith resolution mathematically impossible.
What does living in this environment actually do to us as people? What kind of character does this cultivate?
That is the ultimate question of Section 7. How does this rewire our brains? Corey introduces the sociologist David Riesman and his concept of the other-directed personality.
The other directed personality.
As
opposed to what?
As opposed to the inner-directed personality, which is someone who has a stable, internalized compass. They know what their standards are, and they hold to them regardless of the crowd.
But Riesman argues that modern society produces other-directed people. These are people whose inner compass acts more like a radar. It is constantly spinning, tracking the shifting expectations of a constantly monitored circle of peers.
They are exquisitely tuned to what everyone else is thinking and feeling at any given moment, and they adjust themselves accordingly. They have no core. They just have a radar.
And Corey points out that this other-directed, constantly shifting personality is exactly the character structure suited to a culture where nothing stays settled. And even more importantly, it is exactly the character structure that the new class's professional style heavily rewards.
Think about it. If your job is to constantly produce renewable justificatory arguments, being deeply principled and stubborn is a massive liability.
Having a compass that can track consensus in real time, knowing exactly what vocabulary will win the crowd today, is far more credentially valuable than holding a position against the crowd to see if it's actually true.
And Corey layers in Daniel Bell's concept, the cultural contradictions of capitalism, to show why this class is so trapped in this dynamic. Bell argues that capitalism is fundamentally divided against itself.
Okay, how so?
The productive sphere, your job, the economy demands discipline, delayed gratification, and hard work. But the consumption sphere, the culture, marketing, Entertainment demands hedonism, instant gratification, and constant novelty.
So work hard and save your money like a Puritan, but also buy everything right now and indulge every whim like a hedonist.
And the professional managerial class is formed right in the middle of this contradiction. They are highly disciplined in their productive capability. They spent years getting advanced degrees to learn how to produce these complex arguments.
But culturally, they are driven by this consumption ethos of constant novelty and endless expression.
The result is a class incredibly skilled at generating endlessly renewable debate, but with absolutely zero institutional incentive to do the slow, unglamorous, unrewarded work of actually settling anything.
Because settling a question requires discipline. It requires saying, we are done arguing about this, it is time to build. And that brings us to the final, crucial measure. If endless debate isn't the sign of a sophisticated culture, what is?
Corey defines a sophisticated culture by a very specific metric: the sheer size of its settled ground.
Settled ground.
Not ground that is settled because everyone is terrified to speak or because of blind inheritance that shatters the moment you poke it, but ground that is settled because disciplined people practicing Stirner's ownness, protecting nothing, looked incredibly hard at it, tested it against reality, and found that it holds.
And once it holds, you set it aside and move forward.
Corey compares a mature culture to a mature field of practice, like medicine or engineering or seamanship. These fields have massive, enormous tracts of settled, unargued method. Doctors don't spend every morning debating whether the heart pumps blood or whether germ theory is real. They settle that.
They only argue fiercely at the very, very narrow frontier of the unknown. They debate the absolute cutting-edge experimental treatments. But the core is solid.
A working culture is marked by fraughtness at the frontier. But fraughtness over the center, arguing constantly over ground that a sophisticated culture should have already earned and settled long ago, that is the mark of decline.
Or, as we've seen, it is the mark of a class whose survival depends on the ground never quite closing.
And the essay makes this incredibly honest concession at the end, which I think is vital. Even two completely disciplined people, completely unpossessed by ghosts, can look at the exact same hard case and see two different things.
Practical wisdom does not guarantee universal agreement, but it promises that disagreement will happen far less often than it does among people performing for a crowd or protecting their professional turf.
And when genuine disagreement does happen between disciplined people, it deserves to be taken seriously as the actual frontier, rather than just dismissing the other side as evil or brainwashed.
So let's bring this all together. We started with this comfortable Habermasian idea that our constant, exhausting public debate was a sign of our cultural maturity, that we had overthrown the kings and the priests, and now we were rationally arguing our way to truth.
But through Corey's essay, we discovered that this debate is often a treadmill. We saw how the old middle distance of shared agreements was actively dismantled from within by intellectuals like Fiedler.
We saw how authority collapsed into a demand for therapeutic validation with Lash and Reif.
And then we found Goldner's new class. We realized that this culture of critical discourse isn't neutral reason. It's the professional weapon of a credentialed class that literally profits from keeping the vacuum of meaning open, generating McIntyre's shrill, interminable noise.
And we found our way out through Stirner's discipline of Eigenheit, of not being possessed by the ghost of our own arguments. We found it in Aristotle's practical wisdom, the unobstructed looking that allows reality to dictate the shape of our convergence.
True maturity isn't endless debate. True maturity is the discipline of unprotected, honest looking, and the willingness to let an argument close so we can stand on solid ground.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. Building on everything we have unpacked today, imagine if you were to adopt Stirner's discipline right now.
If you decided to completely strip away every fixed idea, every opinion or stance you hold, simply because your professional circle or your social peers reward you for holding it.
If you dropped all the performative arguments, what is the very first piece of ground you would actually find solid beneath your feet? What do you actually know to be true when the audience leaves the room?
What a profound question to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. I hope this conversation gives you permission to step off the treadmill of endless debate, to stop performing for the crowd, and to start practicing the rare, quiet art of simply unobstructed looking. We will see you next time.